peering out from his light tank Mark 6B. British Army Lieutenant Roy Farran's eyes darted back and forth between the German troops and the 30 or 40 men marching alongside them, if marching was the word. Some of them looked like they could barely stand. Looking closer, he realized who they were. Wounded British and Commonwealth servicemen, dragged from their beds at a nearby hospital here on the island of Crete, now being forced to traipse their way as best they could toward captivity. The 20-year-old lieutenant wouldn't stand for it. He'd never fired a shot in combat before. But today, May 20th, 1941, was as good as any. Without waiting for orders, he drove his tank straight at the German column, took out the guards, and freed every one of the prisoners. Roy Farran's war was already off to a flying start. On the way back, his men came across 5 more German soldiers attempting to surrender. Farran told his gunner to open fire. 2 of the men managed to escape into the trees, but the other 3 were unsuccessful. Within seconds, they were lying lifeless on the ground. Looking back on it years later, he didn't dress the moment up. Quote, "I do not think that I would make a practice of shooting prisoners, but Crete was different, and in the heat of the moment, I had not time to think." For his actions during that first tour of duty, the British Army gave him the Military Cross. 5 days later, it was Farran's turn to get captured. On the night of May 25th, leading his tank into Galetas in an attempt to retake the village, he was hit by anti-tank fire. Before he could get clear, he'd been shot 3 times, in his right arm and both legs. It didn't take long for the Germans to find him. They bundled him onto the next flight to Athens to receive treatment at a POW hospital, then to sit out the rest of the war in captivity. Yet once again, Farran had his own ideas. Despite the pain from his wounds, he snuck out of his hospital bed and crawled under the perimeter wire, disappearing into the streets of occupied Athens. Passed by Greek civilians from house to house, he was eventually able to borrow enough money to hire a small fishing boat, in which he and a handful of other escaped prisoners were able to set sail for British-held Egypt. It was due to take them 4 days. That is, until a storm pushed them off course, and the boat ran out of fuel. Farran, the most senior man on board, partially solved the problem by rigging a sail from a couple of blankets. But then the water ran out too, and this time, Farran had no quick fix. One of the men on board, half out of his mind with thirst, became hysterical. Farran knew that if the panic spread among the rest of the group, it could jeopardize any hope of making it to shore alive. So he solved the problem by knocking the man out cold. Eventually, one of the sergeants on board built a crude device that pulled drinkable water out of the sea, which kept them alive just long enough for a British destroyer to spot them, 40 miles off the coast of Alexandria. They'd been adrift for 10 days. For leading the escape, Farran was awarded a bar to his Military Cross, his second decoration for actions just weeks apart. He was fast earning a reputation as an officer who got results, whatever it took to get them. By early 1942, Farran had brushed off everything the war had thrown at him so far. Then he got behind the wheel of a car. On February 26th, now posted to Gazala in North Africa, he was driving the new commander of the 7th Armored Division, Major General John "Jock" Campbell, for an inspection of the front. Campbell had recently been awarded the Victoria Cross, and Farran had been appointed as his aide-de-camp, a prestigious role that brought him close to senior leadership and showed how much the army valued him. On the way to their destination, Farran hit a stretch of freshly laid clay. He lost control of the car. It skidded and flipped over. When it came to a stop, Farran was outside the wreckage, thrown clear, but barely hurt. Campbell hadn't survived. When Farran realized what had happened, he was so distraught that he thought about taking his own life. Rescue arrived before he had to decide what he might have done next. This was the first time the war had asked something of him that he couldn't simply push through. Not that he let it show. In fact, by summer 1942, nobody could get him to stop fighting if they tried. And they did. After a Luftwaffe attack near El Alamein left his right hand partially paralyzed, doctors sent him home to Britain to recover, expecting that to be the end of his war. But Farran talked his way back onto a medical board months later, got himself past fit, and worked his way onto a draft heading back to North Africa. Little did he realize that a chance encounter was about to connect him with an interesting opportunity. At a transit camp outside Algiers, he ran into an old cavalry friend, Sandy Scratchley. Farran would recall Scratchley asking him, quote, "Why the hell, Roy, don't you join the SAS?" Formed by David Stirling just 2 years earlier, the Special Air Service had already garnered fame as a freewheeling home for Britain's most dangerous operators. With the motto, "Who dares, wins," it sent small teams to carry out extremely risky missions, deep behind enemy lines, whereas the regular army ran on a strict hierarchy, every move authorized from above, someone senior always watching. Stirling's unit was built for soldiers who barely needed orders at all. Farran, who had already spent the war so far treating instructions as more of a starting point than a rule, was exactly the kind of man they were looking for. At the time, he was working with a covert MI9 unit that helped Allied prisoners escape occupied territory. He would later recall his reasons for wanting to leave and join the SAS instead, quote, "MI9 work isn't exciting enough," and didn't kill anybody. He transferred in spring 1943. Before long, he was leading an SAS raid on a lighthouse at Cape Passaro, on the southern tip of Sicily, believed to be hiding a machine gun position covering the beaches where the Allied invasion would land days later. However, Farran's unit was so ravaged by malaria that the 45 men who set out for training landed for the operation as just 11. Farran himself was doubled over with fever, held upright by a fistful of quinine pills. He led the raid regardless and took the objective. Months of chaos across southern Italy followed. By October, Farran was leading his own men on a different kind of mission, landing by rubber boat behind German lines near the river Tronto, where over 5 days his small detachment tore up 17 sections of railway line and mined the roads between Ancona and Pescara, all while dodging German patrols with the help of local Italian civilians. It earned him a second bar to his military cross and a reputation, even among his own SAS colleagues, as a man who simply couldn't be kept off an operation once he decided he was going. As the Allies invaded northern France, Farran prepared to run the boldest operation of his career to date, Operation Wallace. In August 1944, he landed in an airfield near Rennes with 60 men and 20 jeeps, operating, as he often did by this stage, under the nom de guerre Paddy McGinty, borrowed from an old Irish song about a man whose goat swallowed 5 sticks of dynamite. His orders were, in his own words, quote, "Raise hell all across France and make for the Belfort Gap." He did exactly that, pushing 200 miles behind German lines to link up with an existing SAS base near Dijon, ambushing convoys and cutting rail lines along the way. Soon, he and his men approached the town of Châtillon, home to a German garrison, and he intended to take it. Farran sat down for dinner with local French resistance fighters to lay out his plan. They agreed to back him up. But on the morning of the assault, they were nowhere to be seen. Farran didn't know why the French hadn't arrived. Betrayal, bad luck, or simple delay, and he didn't have time to find out. Waiting for an answer risked losing the element of surprise. Pulling back risked his credibility with the very fighters he still needed. Without consulting his superiors, he gave the order to attack. For the next 7.5 hours, mortars and machine gun fire rained down on the enemy positions. By the time it was over, the Germans had suffered around 100 casualties. Farran lost a single man. Believing the attack had come from the French resistance rather than the British, the Germans rounded up 50 local civilians, intending to execute them in reprisal. However, before they could do so, the body of Farran's one fallen trooper was found. Proof the raid had been British after all. The hostages were released unharmed. Back in London, the recommendation for Farran's Distinguished Service Order, for actions officially credited to one Patrick McGinty, called him, quote, the very best type of officer. It highlighted his, quote, personal courage, initiative, and tactical sense, as well as his, quote, complete disregard for his own safety. Farran had gambled an entire operation on his own judgment alone, and won. Yet for all his decorations, by March 1945, headquarters had apparently decided that Roy Farran needed to be kept at arm's length from his own operations. Farran had spent months planning Operation Tombola. It was to be a raid deep behind enemy lines near Reggio Emilia, a joint force of SAS troops, Italian partisans, and Russian deserters from the German army, built to harass the retreating Germans ahead of an Allied spring offensive. Headquarters had agreed to the plan, but only on one condition. Farran would stay behind in Florence to coordinate from a safe distance. He was allowed to fly with his men to the drop zone, but not to jump with them. Whether leadership wanted to keep their most experienced officer out of the line of fire, or simply didn't trust him to stay within whatever plan they approved, is not clear. Whatever their motivation, it proved to be in vain. When the operation began and the men started jumping, Farran fell out of the aircraft. It was a complete coincidence that he just so happened to be wearing a parachute at the time and had his personal kit with him. Nobody who knew him was fooled. But once he was descending through the clouds, there was nothing that could be done about it. What he found on the ground did not inspire much confidence. Looking over the partisans he was about to lead, Farran commented that, quote, nearly all of them have some physical defect, and privately compared the whole assembled force to a picture of medieval peasant leader Wat Tyler's rebellion. It didn't matter. Within days, he turned them into a functioning battalion and set his sights on the headquarters of a German mountain corps, hidden inside 2 villas in the town of Albanea. Command staff approved the target in principle, but insisted the attack wait, timed to a larger Allied offensive still weeks away. Farran and his Special Operations Executive counterpart ignored the instructions and pushed ahead on the original date regardless. By the time a final order arrived, telling them to call the operation off altogether, Farran was already on the march. He didn't turn back. On the night of March 27th, Farran's men closed in on Albanea. A Scottish bagpiper, brought in specifically for this moment, opened the assault with Highland Laddie, the wail of the pipes tangling with the first bursts of gunfire. Farran's raiders stormed the 2 villas that made up the German headquarters. In one of them, a bazooka meant to blow the door open misfired, and the attackers had to force their way in on foot, room by room, as the Germans fought back from the floor above. Grenades, explosives, and looted furniture set the building alight, driving the remaining defenders out into gunfire that made sure they didn't get far. 2 German soldiers who had surrendered partway through the fighting were, according to several accounts of the battle, quote, dealt with. By the time the shooting stopped, there were over 50 German casualties, and an enemy headquarters lay in ruins. Back at headquarters, some officers wanted him formally court-martialed for defying orders, not once, but twice. One of Farran's own colleagues, Bob Walker Brown, later said he'd spent most of his time trying to keep it from happening. In the end, nobody had to. The Americans awarded Farran the Legion of Merit instead, and the matter quietly disappeared. Within weeks, the war that had made Roy Farran into a legend was over. But the instincts that had earned him a chest full of medals during the conflict, the willingness to act alone, to strike first and explain later, to treat the rules as more of a suggestion, had not gone anywhere. Now, the British establishment hoped it could repurpose them for a peacetime mission. In 1947, Farran was approached by Brigadier Bernard Ferguson for a special mission: head to Palestine and lead a small squad working undercover to hunt down members of the Jewish paramilitary groups whose escalating campaign of attacks was threatening British rule. Ferguson and Nicole Gray, the Inspector General of the Palestine Police, specifically wanted Special Forces men for the role, men to whom operating covertly in foreign lands would be second nature. But not everyone agreed. Gray's predecessor, Brigadier John Reimer Jones, one that handing this kind of work to former Special Forces officers would, quote, end in catastrophe. Farran had no background in policing, no experience gathering intelligence, building a case, or working within a legal system rather than around one. But none of that seemed to matter. He took the job the way he took every job, on his own terms. As far as he understood, he had permission to operate as he pleased. In his words, quote, carte blanche, a free hand. Training lasted only a few weeks, mostly pistol drills and close-quarters combat. Then Farran and his men, driving a citrus delivery truck and a dry cleaner's van, dressed as Jewish civilians, were sent out into Jerusalem streets to find and detain suspected members of the groups Britain had never had much luck tracking. Farran might have seen it as little different from the SAS operations he'd carried out behind enemy lines a few years earlier. But this wasn't World War II, and Palestine wasn't occupied Europe. Nobody stopped to ask what happens when a man built entirely for war is handed a job that isn't one. On May 6, 1947, a 17-year-old boy went out to put up posters. Alexander Rubowitz was a member of Lehi, one of the Jewish paramilitary groups that Farran's squad had been sent to Palestine to hunt. Like many teenagers in the movement, his job wasn't to fight. It was to run errands, too small for anyone to notice. Carrying messages, distributing leaflets, pasting up posters on walls around Jerusalem's Mea Shearim neighborhood in the dead of night. His own mother had encouraged him to keep at it, reportedly telling his brothers, who'd begged him to stop, quote, he has to go. They're all going now. He has to go and succeed. That evening, a struggle broke out on a Jerusalem street corner. A heavy-set man chased down a fleeing teenage boy, forcing him toward a waiting car. A 15-year-old named Mir Cohen walked over to ask what was happening. The man identified himself as a police officer and threatened to shoot Cohen if he didn't back away. As the car door slammed shut, Cohen heard a shout from inside, in Hebrew, quote, I'm from the Rubowitz family. Then the car drove off into the night. What happened next has never been fully established, but it's believed that Rubowitz was taken to a remote location and interrogated for information about the Lehi network. When he had nothing more to give, the interrogation turned fatal. His body was never found. The only real lead was a hat, a gray Trilby hat, found near the spot where Rubowitz had last been seen, with a single word written inside the band. It wasn't entirely possible to make out what the word said with certainty, but it looked a lot like Farran. For Palestine's police force, it was all they needed. The CID was almost certain that Rubowitz was no longer alive, and that Farran's squad was responsible. Sir Henry Gurney, the Mandate's chief secretary, gave direct orders for Farran to be brought to trial as a criminal. Roy Farran had once escaped from the German army. Now he had to escape from his own side. Placed under house arrest as the investigation closed in, Farran stole a car in the middle of the night and crossed the border into Syria, along with 2 of his own men. He made it to the British legation in Damascus and told his story to whoever would listen. The Syrians, sympathetic to a British officer on the run, offered him a way out entirely, political asylum, and a job training their own military. Farran turned it down. Brigadier Ferguson, his former commanding officer, persuaded him to return voluntarily, on the understanding that matters would be handled fairly. They were not. The moment Farran set foot back in Palestine, he was arrested and thrown into a cell at Allenby Barracks in Jerusalem. So he escaped again. But by now, it wasn't just the British authorities chasing him. It was the Stern Gang, the paramilitary group Rubowitz had belonged to, who began targeting Farran's own friends in reprisal for his disappearance. Farran gave himself up, rather than let anyone else pay for it. He stood trial at a British military court in Jerusalem, charged with taking Rubowitz's life. Farran denied everything. The case against him was thin. There was no body, and no witness who could place him at the scene with certainty. And it kept getting thinner. Ferguson, The one man who might have testified to something damaging refused to take the stand at all, citing his own right not to incriminate himself. Notes written in Farran's own hand while he was in custody, notes that reportedly amounted to a confession, were ruled inadmissible, protected as privileged material prepared for his defense. Witnesses who claimed to have seen Rubowitz forced into a car failed to pick Farran out of a lineup. Nobody could prove the hat was his. Nobody could even prove Rubowitz wasn't still alive somewhere. On October 2nd, 1947, Roy Farran was acquitted. If the authorities weren't going to punish him, his enemies decided he'd be made to pay in a different way. It was May 3rd, 1948, almost exactly a year since Alexander Rubowitz disappeared. Farran, a free man, was staying with friends in Scotland, far from the family home in Codsall, Staffordshire, where his parents and brothers were going about an ordinary morning. A parcel came addressed to R. Farran. Roy's youngest brother happened to be the one at home to receive it. His name was Rex. He carried it inside and started to open it himself. It was made to look like a book, a volume of Shakespeare, hollowed out and packed with explosives. It detonated as Rex opened it, tearing through his stomach and hands. He was still alive when he reached the hospital. According to those with him, his last words were, quote, "Am I dying like a Farran?" Then, quote, "No revenge." The bomb had been sent by a Leahy cell operating in Britain. But despite the tragedy, life would go on for Roy Farran. After flying down from Scotland for Rex's funeral, he left for Rhodesia, then Canada, where he started afresh. A farm, a newspaper, eventually a long career in provincial politics. Whatever had happened in Palestine, he did his best to avoid talking about it. In 1974, Alexander Rubowitz's nephew, Moshe, traveled all the way to Canada, hoping to meet the man he'd grown up believing was responsible for his uncle's fate. He wasn't asking for a trial or an apology, just the location of a body, so the family could finally bury him properly. Farran's lawyer turned him away at the door. By the time Roy Farran passed away in 2006, age 85, it was almost as if two different people had gone. Some eulogized him as one of the very best Britain had to offer in World War II. He was an archetypal rogue hero of the early SAS, intrepid, resourceful, indefatigable, before becoming a highly respected public figure in Canada. Others demonized him as a violent brute who'd taken the life of a young boy and then spent decades refusing to discuss it. It's possible that both were right. Roy Farran had been exactly what Britain needed to defeat Hitler. Nobody had ever thought to ask if he was the right solution for what came after.